Welcome to the Big Pricing Webinar on Demand. I'm Rosh Sillars, and this is the first of a series of webinars designed to help you understand photography pricing in the digital age. You know, photography pricing is a tough subject. A lot of photographers don't want to deal with it. But if you want to do what you love to do and continue doing it, running your own business, you need to understand pricing. And it's a tough subject. Now, the math, the basics of pricing certainly isn't that tough. It's just basic mathematics. But the hard part is the emotional part. The emotional part of trying to figure out what price should I send that client, because you know, if it's too high, you might lose a great opportunity. But if it's too low, well, then you may be leaving money on the table. Are you making enough money to survive, to pay the rent? You need to know those things. And so we're going to go through a basic process to help you establish your rates. The bottom line is that rates are all over the board. Some people charge really low and some people charge really high, and both get jobs. So you need to find a rate that you're comfortable with. A rate that will cover your expenses as well as keep you competitive. That's really important. Now, we start off with a very basic premise. You need information. And where do you get the information first to help you understand what price to give a client? Well, you talk to the client and you ask a lot of questions. That's probably the best tip I can possibly give you. Ask a lot of questions. When you receive that email, when you receive that phone call, don't just say, here is my price. No. Take a moment. Let them know you'll get back to them. But after you ask them a few questions about their project, ask them, do they have any examples of what they're looking for? That's always helpful because it can help you really get a grasp around the production that they are expecting in the photographs that they want. Or maybe there's some images on your website that they want similar images for their campaign or for their family or wedding or senior portraits. There are a lot of questions you can ask about timeline, but we'll get all deeper into that in the future webinars. So for now, let's stick with the very basics. And I'll probably reference the other webinars that we have available to you throughout this section just to let you know that we have additional information. Okay, so to figure out how much to charge, you have to understand what is your basic costs. What is your CODB? What's that stand for? Cost of doing business. You need to understand how much it costs you to run your company, to survive, quite honestly, not just to pay for your next camera. You know, a lot of photographers think, well, I don't have much overhead, so I don't really need to charge very much. Well, if it's your business, you need to charge enough to live on. You need to charge enough to pay your rent and to pay your insurance. If you're on your own, you have health insurance, your insurance for your business, insurance for your cameras, insurance for your transportation. Lots of insurance opportunities out there. Unfortunately, you have to be covered, and you need good transportation, and you need to upgrade your software and upgrade your cameras and fix and repair broken equipment. There's a lot more than you really think there may be. And so you need to write that down, and that is part of the process of figuring out the cost of doing business. So for this situation, for our little example here, we're going to start with some very basic numbers. And for some of you, you may say, wow, that's high. And for others, you say, wow, that's really low. Don't worry about what the actual numbers are so much as to understand that you need to replicate this process to figure out what your numbers are. And that will depend on where you live and the type of photography you do. Different types of photography command different really production levels and different places in which people live. New York has a different cost of living than we do here in Michigan. So you need to consider those factors when looking at even the numbers that I present to you today. These are just general numbers to work with. So let's figure that the average cost of doing business, once you figure out your insurance and all that, and we have a whole section on that in the future webinars, how to break all that down and really figure it all out. But let's say your average is about $2,000 a month to run your business. Now, it may be less for you, and it may be a lot more if you own your own studio. So $2,000 is a good starting point. Now, that includes all the things that you need on a daily basis and a monthly and yearly basis, obviously. So on a yearly basis, that's $24,000 a year you need to make base just to cover the cost to run your business. But what about profit? What about your cost of living? Well, let's say you want to make what the average person in the United States makes. Well, that's around $50,000 a year. And let's keep the numbers really easy. Let's just call it $4,000 per month, okay? So $4,000 per month, $48,000 per year. Now, quite honestly, before you get too excited, a lot of photographers don't make much more than $25,000 a year. There are a lot of photographers that make $18,000, $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 a year, and that's all they make. But there are photographers who make millions of dollars a year, or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and a lot of that has to do with how good they are at business and understanding the pricing and understanding the branding power of pricing and how pricing really does become a part of your marketing. And again, something else we talk about in future series within this webinar. But let's get back to our basics. So we have $2,000 for our base of running our business and $4,000 for our basic cost of living and a comfortable wage. Okay, so that is $6,000 per month, or doing old school math, $72,000 per year. So now you have a base, and you know what? You're ahead of a lot of photographers right now because now you know your base. You've done the math, you've figured it all out, you've done your spreadsheets, you've figured out that ultimately your number is here, and now you need to know how much to charge per day or per hour. And how do you do that? Well, honestly, a lot of photographers only work really maybe a day or two a week. Maybe not work is the wrong word. Actually photograph a day or two a week, because you have days where you're doing marketing and networking. There are days you're doing post-production. You may be doing 2 hours of post-production for every hour of photography. So you need to consider that as part of your cost of doing business too. So you figured out all this. Now you say you work 100 days during the year of actual photography. Now, if you're in the beginning of your career, quite honestly, that number may be 50 days over the year. So that would mean your number would be double the person with the same expenses who works 100 days a year. But we're going to use the 100 because, quite honestly, that's much easier math. So let's look at that. And so for 100 working days for the year, we have to say, okay, we divide this number into that number. So however many days you plan to work the next year. Now, you may have a year behind you and say, wow, I worked 75 days last year. Okay, use that number for your next year. Or maybe you plan to work 125. You think you can do it. You have a good plan in place for your marketing and so forth. You think you're going to get 125 days. Then use that number and divide it. However you wish to do that. But remember, you need to add the increased costs of working that many days, maybe studio time if you need that, maybe additional production time that you might need, or of course marketing to get that additional 125. So there are a lot of expenses that will of course increase to figure out that number. So anyway, we look at that 100 number and we divide it into, that means we need to make $720 per day. Now, when I do this exercise, quite often when I work with photographers, that number is quite often closer to 1,500. And of course, if you have that 50 days a year working, well then that number doubles to like 1,440, right? So here's the thing. I figure that most of the time, we quite often run around $1,500 per day on average just to make the baseline for a photographer. But for our example, let's kind of split the difference here and just call it $1,000. $1,000 per day is what we need to make. And so now we know. And a photographer generally bases their day off of 10 hours. That's the traditional number. And so it's usually like an hour of setup, 8 hours of work, and an hour of breakdown, which makes the 10 hours. And so if we want to know how many how much to charge per hour, well, then we just divide that 10, and so that's $100 per hour. I'll say, wow, $100 per hour? I'm not a doctor or lawyer, I just want to take pictures. Well, remember, you're only working probably a couple hours a week. Now, if you're hired by a company, that's quite different. I mean, if you're a full-time employee, that's a totally different animal than what we're talking about here. Most photographers are freelance, work on their own, have their own business. So they need to consider that they only really photograph a couple hours or a couple days a week. In some cases, a couple hours, in some weeks, nothing. I mean, it does go up and down like that. So you need to consider that. A lot of times when people complain about the photographers, how can you make $1,000 or $1,500 a day? Well, you know, they're comparing their job of 40-hour work week consistently every week to our two days a week. And there's a big difference. If you're working 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week, and making $15, $25, $50 an hour, well, that's nice and that's consistent, but that's not the consistency a lot of photographers face. And so we need to make enough money to survive and keep a good base on a regular scale, regular basis, right? So, okay, so let's use this $1,000 number. And so in the future segments that we work here, we'll use the $1,000 number. We'll also use the $1,500 number, but I'll explain that in a moment. Because next, after we figured out our cost of doing business, we need to consider the usage of our photographs. And it starts with the copyright conversation. You know, when you press that shutter, you are the proud owner of a copyright. It doesn't matter what else you do. You can register that copyright, but you don't have to. It's just the law. Photographers are not being mean about it. They own the copyright, and that copyright has value. And we kind of live in a society that's saying, you know, a lot of photographers say, oh, that copyright isn't valuable to me, and they don't care if someone hands them a work made for hire contract, which is important to understand because basically all they're saying to you is that we want to hire you, and then after you're done with the assignment, we want to fire you and we own your copyright. You say, who cares about that? Because I don't care about my copyright. Well, you know something? Let me ask you this question. If your copyright wasn't valuable, then why is everyone working so hard to get it? And the fact is, it's because it has value. Even if you don't think it has value, and there's a reason people are asking for it. So it has value. And so you need to consider that. And a lot of photographers, when people ask for their copyright, will increase the value of the price that they offer from $1,000 to maybe increase it 50% or 100%. So it would be $1,500 or $2,000 because they need to make money because they can't make money from that photograph ever again. A lot of photography and a lot of photographers make money by reselling their photographs over and over again. And if you don't have that right, if that right is taken from you, well then you're losing the opportunity to make more money. So your copyright is important. So if you're ever thinking that, oh, mine isn't important, yes it is, and ask why it is that they're looking for that copyright. Now there's a whole conversation much deeper about copyright and how to really approach, and there's some good ways you can approach people who send you contracts with work made for hire, and that's what we'll talk about in future webinars. But right now, we need to consider use, and quite often, we need to say, look, this $1,000 number, that is for personal use. That's our baseline, okay? Personal use is the wedding, the senior portraits, the personal portraits, or baby portraits. That's personal use. These people are not making money off of your photographs. But some people are making money off your photographs. And that's when we consider the usage equation. And there's a whole process to figure out what is it that I need to add as a premium or licensing fee on top of this $1,000. Again, there are many different ways to figure out your photography pricing. And we're going to talk about 2 of them today, but there are many, many more than that. And again, something we talk more in the other webinars. We'll get into detail on just a whole webinar on all the different ways to price your photography. It's an amazing webinar, and I encourage you to take a look at it. So here we go. So different types of pricing and how that premium is figured out. Now here's the thing. You know, a mom and pop store might ask to use your photograph, and they may put it on their their window and to capture people's attention. It's a beautiful photograph, and they might make a little bit more money because they used your photograph. But if another company comes along, uses the same photograph and puts it on billboards and national magazines and newspaper ads, they're making a lot more money with your photograph. In other words, the value of that photograph has increased. And so how you figure out how much to charge and how much of a premium, a licensing fee or premium you should add to your base price really has to do with the distribution of the photograph. And maybe you can have a list, and we'll talk about that list in a few moments, but have a list related to, well, websites. Using photographs for the web is very common, or social media. So you may say, a website that has less than 10,000 visitors a month, this is my premium, I add 10%. And websites that have over 1 million views per month, well, then we'll add 100% to our price. It can be many variations. Again, stuff we can talk much more deeply about in the future webinars. And so that's part of the whole usage and copyright scenario. And we need to consider something here with the types of pricing. Let's kind of get into that. This is based off of what photographers kind of refer to as a day rate or hourly rates. And it's very common. And you know what? I don't like day rates or hourly rates except for when I'm doing events. Events, not so bad. Not a bad way to go about it, because you can't become more efficient at an event. You're there for 8 hours, here's my rate, and that's it. What do I mean by efficient? Well, let me talk about this. Let me give you some examples here. So let's say, for sake of argument, let's call it $1,500 a day, okay? And let's say that a company calls you and says, hey, we need 10 photographs for our website, okay? And we say, all right, $1,500 a day for the usage that they want, and $500 for the expenses. Okay, so that would be a total of $2,000, right? Okay, now, a lot of people say, wow, $1,500 a day for a photographer, why do they charge so much? Well, we just had that conversation, right? We don't work 40 hours a week. At least most photographers don't, and those that do obviously are doing very well, and that's wonderful. But you need to consider the fact that most of us don't. And you need to make a living, and you need to figure out, based on your cost of doing business, what that number should be, and plus the usage. Now, so we've come to $1,500 for that day, $500 for expenses. That may be the location expenses and an assistant and so forth. There are a number of expenses that could be involved in creating those 10 images that this company is asking for. And so let's go through a couple scenarios here. Let's say that you get done at 2 o'clock. Your assignment is done at 2 o'clock. You got all 10 images done. And wow, how great. Except now they're thinking, wait a minute, you were here for a day. So if you're supposed to be here for a day and you're done at 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock or noon, what do they want? Well, they want a discount, of course, right? Because you put the value of the images, you put time as part of the value of the images, your time specifically, right? And so now they're looking for a discount. Now let's say that, oh, it's 3 o'clock and you are all done with all 10 images, and they say, oh wait, we have a few more, we're early, we're gonna end at 5, right? So we have a few more images, we have 5 more portraits, or we have 5 more locations that we can do real quick in those 2 hours, no problem. Well, it is a problem, because you say, well, I want a happy client, of course, right? Of course you want a happy client, but here's the thing. You, in your cost of doing business, in your whole process, you figured on 10 images. But what are you doing tomorrow? Well, you're editing those images, right? And so you have money set aside, because you figured that out in your price, to edit and go through based on the production and the post-production needs and your style for 10 images. Now, if they add those images in, you're doing the post-production and all that work for free. Or just diluting the value or how much you get paid for all of your other work, right? So you don't want to work for free. You need to make sure that you are paid for everything, and you don't want to say, well, we only said 10 images, and that's just rude, right? We only said 10 images, or let's say, it's 1 o'clock, but you reserved me for the whole day. So you're just going to have to pay me for the full day. What are they going to feel? They're going to feel kind of cheated. So that's why I don't like using day rates for a lot of commercial aspects. It just really doesn't work unless it's an event. And there you can still get away with the day rate or the hourly rate. What I prefer is called per image pricing. And I'll just put PIP to help remind you, per image pricing. Per image pricing is let's say use the same scenario. We use $1,500 as our internal cost of doing business number. We need to know what our cost of doing business. We need to know our day rate. But that is an internal number. And then we have $500 for expenses. And so we say, 10 images, we'll divide that number, that 2,000 by 10. And what do we get? $200 per image. You know what? That's a lot easier to wrap your head around versus saying, that photographer makes $1,500 a day. We've now taken the time element off of the whole process, off of the images, the value of creating those images, and just put a value of that image at $200. That's, again, a lot easier for that client to digest. And so I find this a much easier way to go about it. Because now let's put this same scenario. Let's run the same scenario. We're done at 1 o'clock. We've done our 10 images. What does the client want? Nothing. They don't want a discount. They're excited. We're all happy. We're done early for the day. Right? Now, let's say we're done at 3. And they say, but we have 5 more people just walked in and need their portraits taken. All right, or 5 more locations. Okay, great. Now, the client knows the value of each image, so you've added that. So instead of making $2,000, you've now made 3. And your post-production time is still covered and paid for. So the more you work, the more you're paid. The better job you do, the more you're paid. Now, what if they only select 8? Well, then maybe you didn't do a great job. It's possible. This is a win-win scenario. But honestly, it doesn't happen very often. Is it possible that they could say, we don't want any of your images? Yep, it is possible. That's the risk-reward scenario. But you can always put a lot of different stipulations in there. Say, look, you want to make sure you cover your basis. You say, look, you asked for 10, you have to pay for 10. If you don't have to pay for any additional beyond that if you don't want to. Hey, that's fine. Or you could just say, look, my costs I know are covered at 3 images. That's $600, right? So I know I'm covered there, but so you have to buy at least 3 images. There are so many different ways. You can line item out certain expenses, like if you have assistants, you can say, well, no matter what, you have to pay for the assistants. And again, that's something we talk more about in the pricing webinar. So we'll talk more about that in the different types of pricing webinar. So this is what I consider one of the best ways to go in terms of pricing. It's a win-win scenario, and there's a lot of different ways that you can approach it. Now, there's also something else to consider, the free scenario and the low-cost scenario. And a lot of times photographers say, I just want to get my foot in the door. This is a great company. I'm going to lower my price. The worst thing that can happen to you is to be known as the low-price photographer, the cheap photographer. Because you know what? If your job is on the line and you have a big assignment and you want to hire a photographer, do you think going back to your boss and saying, well, this project did not work. I found the cheapest photographer I could? No. The big assignments tend to go to the people who charge a lot of money for a reason, because it gives people confidence that they have made the right choice, whether it's true or not. Whether this photographer or this photographer could have done the job depending on the price, no, it doesn't. But these people with the high prices have confidence, and so does the client have confidence. So, but sometimes you want to work for a charity. Sometimes you want to get your foot in the door. So what do you do? Well, let me give you a little tip. The best thing to do is to always invoice for your full rate. So, for example, you want to do a job that you would normally charge $2,000 for. And, well, you want to make sure your expenses are covered, and you want to make sure that you make a little bit of money. So you charge, say, look, we'll do it for $750. And it's normally $2,000. Like, well, you don't want to just invoice them for $750, you want them to remember that you are a $2,000 photographer. So you invoice them for $2,000, and then you subtract $1,250, which equals the $750, right? And so now they can see that you would normally charge $2,000. You give them the discount and just charge them for the $750. The same thing goes for the charities. A lot of times you want to work for a charity because you believe in the cause, and always only work for the charities you believe in. Just because somebody says, and please don't fall for this, oh, you'll get a lot of exposure. You need a lot of consistency for good exposure to work. So a one-time flyer or something is not good exposure, so don't fall for that. Only work for the companies that really want to work, that you really want to work for. And so what you can do is say, look, I'll do it at no charge. That's fine. I want to help you, but I'm going to invoice you. I'm going to send you an invoice so they can see that your price is $2,000 minus 100%, minus $2,000, and they got it for zero, which is fine. But this way, they know your value, and when people say, oh, who's your photographer? Well, you can say, well, you know, this photographer we use is really good, and they charge like $2,000 a day. At least now they've established that you're a professional photographer, versus them saying, well, they do it for nothing for me, so maybe they'll do it nothing for you. That's not what you want. Or they do this every year for me for $100. I'm sure they'll do it for $100 for you. You do not want those kind of referrals. So you need to establish yourself, okay, I am at this level, but for you, I'm going to give you the discount. And that is a really good hint and a really good way to go about it, to keep your reputation, to keep your brand solid. So now we know. Here are the basics. We know that we want to understand our cost of doing business. We understand our copyright, and that our images actually have value, and actually have more value as we increase and go up the ladder in terms of distribution and usage. And we also know there are many different ways in which we can price our photography, and it's important to know that. And we're going to explore all those areas, as well as other areas related to pricing, relating to growing your business. It's important to understand that the basic pricing model that you use will help you in either succeeding or failing. And if you have confidence in your price and you have confidence in your work, you're going to grow your business, and you're going to be a respected photographer in your area of the industry.